On the 9th of April, 1989, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane smelled of furniture polish and anticipation. Backstage, in a corridor where Edmund Keane and David Garrick had once paced before their entrances, a woman pushed a wheelchair over cables and scuffed floorboards. Her name was Belinda. She had been pushing this chair in one form or another for nearly 2 decades. Her arms no longer trembled with the effort. The rest of her sometimes did. The man in the chair wore a suit. She had insisted on that. Charcoal grey, the kind he would have chosen himself in the years when choosing was still something his fingers could manage. The jacket hung loose across shoulders that had once carried it like armor. Tucked into the breast pocket, almost hidden by the fold of a white handkerchief, sat a 7-inch cigarette holder. Dunhill, tortoiseshell, absurdly elegant. It had not touched his lips in years. His hands could no longer raise it. But Belinda had placed it there anyway, the way one might lay flowers on a grave that the dead cannot smell. She leaned down as they reached the wings. "Ready, darling." His lips moved. The sound that emerged was thin, papery, the ghost of a voice that had once filled theatres twice this size without amplification. She bent closer, her ear almost touching his mouth. "Tell them I'm still bloody marvelous." She smiled. He could not. Out front, the auditorium was full. They had come for an evening billed as a celebration, though the word sat uneasily on what was, in truth, an act of rescue. On the programme, Jack Douglas, Richard Briers, Eric Sykes, and a handful of other names from a Britain that was rapidly becoming memory. Comedians, character actors, old soldiers of variety. They had come to tell jokes, share anecdotes, and pass the hat for a man who had once earned £5,000 a week and now could not afford his own medicine. The man in the wheelchair was Terry Thomas. That name, with its distinctive hyphen, its jaunty rhythm, had once been among the most bankable in British entertainment. For 3 decades, he had embodied a very particular kind of Englishman. The bounder, the cad, the gloriously unapologetic rotter with a carnation in his buttonhole and mischief behind his monocle. He had made more than 40 films. He had topped variety bills from the London Palladium to Las Vegas. He had charmed his way through 2 marriages, 1 public scandal, and an international career that stretched from Pinewood Studios to Hollywood and back again. All of it had depended on a body that obeyed its owner, on hands steady enough to adjust a monocle, on a face mobile enough to convey, in a single raised eyebrow, the entire spectrum of upper-class disdain, on a voice that could wring a laugh from a line that, on the page, looked like nothing at all. Now that body sat in a wheelchair in the wings of Drury Lane, and it no longer obeyed anyone. The disease had a name: Parkinson's. Diagnosed in 1971, though the tremor in his left hand had begun whispering its warnings years before. Since then, it had advanced with the patience of a siege, taking first his steadiness, then his mobility, then his speech, then his expression. His mind remained. That was the cruelest refinement of all. £75,000. That was the final tally of the evening. £75,000 to keep alive a man who had made millions laugh. When it was over, they brought him out. The wheelchair emerged from the wings into the light, and the auditorium rose, and the applause was like a wave breaking over a rock that could not move. A tear ran down his cheek. The disease permitted that, at least. One small mercy in 19 years of theft. How did this happen? How did the most audacious comedian in Britain end up dependent on the kindness of colleagues for the right to die with a roof over his head? To answer that, one must go back. Not to the stage, not to the screen, not even to the BBC studios where his career first caught fire. Further than that. Back to a suburb of North London, to a house on a quiet street, to a boy who loathed his own name and learned, before he was old enough to understand why, that the only reliable way to stop two adults tearing each other apart was to make them laugh. He was born in July of 1911, though even that bare fact refuses to behave itself. Most authoritative records give the date as the 10th. Others, including the New York Times obituary published the day after his death, insist upon the 14th. No birth certificate has surfaced in the public domain to settle the matter. Nothing about this man would ever be quite as straightforward as it appeared. What is not in dispute is the address. 53 Lichfield Grove, Finchley, in what was then a respectable but unremarkable corner of North London. The house was solid, semi-detached, the kind of dwelling that spoke of modest ambition and careful bookkeeping. Inside it, neither was going particularly well. His father, Ernest Frederick Stevens, worked as a clerk in the city, a quiet man, a careful man. A man who returned each evening on the same train, read the same newspaper, and drank a little more than was good for him with a regularity that suggested not pleasure but anesthesia. His mother, Ellen Elizabeth Hoare, came from a family that considered itself a notch above. She, too, drank, not dramatically, but with the steady determination of a woman who had expected more from marriage and found less. Their union was not a battlefield. It was something quieter, and in its way, worse. A long, slow mutual withdrawal conducted over breakfast tables and behind closed doors. They did not shout. They froze. The house on Lichfield Grove was clean, orderly, and saturated with the particular misery of two people who had run out of things to say to each other. Into this silence, a noisy child. Thomas Terry Hoare Stevens, for that was the full catastrophe of his birth name, arrived bellowing and did not stop. He was loud in a household that prized quiet. He was ebullient in a family that valued restraint. And he was saddled, from his first day at school, with a surname that was a gift to every bully in North London. Hoare, say it aloud. Now imagine being 11 years old in a playground full of boys who have just discovered what whore means. But the boy discovered something. He discovered that if he got to the joke first, if he was the one pulling faces and doing voices, then the laughter changed direction. It stopped being aimed at him and started flowing from him. He was no longer the victim. He was the comedian. There is a scene from his childhood that surfaces in several biographical accounts. He was 6 years old. His parents were arguing, his mother crying, his father standing by the window with his jaw set, staring at the garden as though it had personally offended him. The boy ran into the center of the room. He pulled faces. He impersonated the neighbors, Mrs. Henderson's waddle, Mr. Clark's stammer. He contorted his small body into shapes that had no business being funny but were. His mother stopped crying. His father snorted. The tension broke. A 6-year-old child had learned the lesson that would define his entire existence. Humor was a weapon, a shield, and a kind of glue. It could hold together things that were falling apart. He was sent to Ardingly College, a minor public school in Sussex, where his talent for disruption flourished and his talent for academic work did not. The breaking point came during a Latin lesson. The master, a humorless man with a chalk-dusted gown, had been conjugating verbs for 20 minutes when young Stevens rose from his desk, adopted the posture of a Roman senator, and delivered the conjugation as though addressing the forum. The class collapsed. The master did not. Thomas was expelled shortly afterwards. The school saw indiscipline. He saw an audience. The disagreement was irreconcilable. What followed was the Smithfield meat market. 15 shillings a week as a clerk, surrounded by hanging carcasses and men in blood-stained aprons whose humour ran to the robust. It was an unlikely incubator for one of Britain's most elegant performers, but the market gave him something that school had not, an audience that could not walk out. His colleagues were trapped there, 8 hours a day, amid the cold and the smell and the tedium, and into their tedium stepped young Tom Stevens, doing Erich von Stroheim, the Austrian-born director famous for playing Prussian villains, in an imaginary monocle, doing the Hunchback of Notre Dame with a side of beef for a hump. One morning, a butcher wiped his hands on his apron and looked at the boy with something between amusement and exasperation. "Stevens, what on earth are you doing?" Tom froze in a pose of magnificent Teutonic arrogance, one hand raised as though adjusting a monocle that was not there. "I am not Stevens. I am Colonel Featherstone Horbumley, and I require your finest cut of sirloin." "Feather what?" "Precisely what everyone says when I introduce myself. That is rather the point." The butchers laughed. They always did. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the boy filed away the name and the lesson it contained. That the funniest thing about the English class system was not the people at the top or the bottom, but the ludicrous distance between the two and the elaborate pantomime required to maintain it. It was during these years that the persona began to take shape. The monocle appeared first, bought for pennies at a junk shop, worn initially as a joke, then as a habit, then as armor. The red carnation followed, tucked into the buttonhole each morning with the gravity of a man pinning on a medal. None of it was real. That was the point, and that was the genius. Thomas Terry Hoare Stevens, clerk, son of a clerk, had invented a character, the imperturbable English gentleman, effortlessly superior, magnificently rude, and blessed with the kind of self-assurance that only the truly insecure can manufacture. The cigarette holder came last. He found it in a Dunhill catalogue. 7 inches of tortoiseshell. He ordered it, unwrapped it, held it up to the light, and placed it between his lips at an angle that suggested not merely smoking, but the philosophical contemplation of smoke. It completed the picture. The boy from Finchley had built himself a suit of armor, and every piece of it was a lie, and the lie was magnificent. In 1927, the 16-year-old Tom Stevens fell in love for the first time. The object of his affections was unexpected, and in its way prophetic. Her name was Kate Dixon, and she was the family's domestic help. Not a starlet, not a dancer, not a society beauty glimpsed across a crowded ballroom. A servant in the parlance of the day. What passed between them is unrecorded in any detail. The biographical sources confirm the relationship and little else. A boy of 16, a young woman whose station in the household made the attachment both thrilling and impossible, and a lesson absorbed early, that when he made a woman laugh, the distance between them shrank to nothing. Kate Dixon vanished from the record as quietly as she had entered it, leaving behind only the faintest outline of a first intimacy. The years between that first affair and his entry into professional entertainment are sparsely documented. He drifted. He worked. He haunted the variety theatres of North London as a spectator, studying the comedians the way a medical student studies anatomy, not for pleasure alone, but to understand the machinery. By the early 1930s, he had begun to claw his way into the lower reaches of the business. Cabaret, variety, small venues with sticky floors, the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume, and audiences who had paid sixpence for the privilege of heckling. London in those years was a city bracing itself. Unemployment hung over the streets like fog, and the newspapers carried headlines from Berlin that made thoughtful people uneasy. But the music halls still filled, because people who cannot afford hope can sometimes afford a ticket. He was not yet Terry Thomas. He was still assembling the parts. The voice, the posture, the timing, the ineffable air of a man who has wandered into the wrong party and decided to stay. But he was learning his trade night after night, discovering which pauses drew the laugh and which killed it, which gestures read from the back row and which disappeared into the darkness beyond the footlights. Then, in 1936, The Water. He was filming a short, one of those forgettable quota quickies that British studios churned out by the dozen, and a scene required him to dive into a pool. The dive went wrong. The details are sparse, but the result was permanent. Partial hearing loss in one ear. A comedian who depended on timing, on the split-second registration of an audience's response, on the ability to hear the intake of breath that precedes a laugh and ride it like a wave. For such a man, the injury was a quiet catastrophe. He adapted. He compensated. He told no one. It was in 1937, at an audition in London, that he met the woman who would become his first wife. Ida Florence Margaret Patlansky, known professionally as Pat Patlansky, was a dancer. The surname announced Eastern European roots. The woman herself announced nothing quietly. She was vivid, direct, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from earning a living with one's body. She saw through his act immediately. Not through the monocle and the carnation, those were still in their infancy, but through the deeper performance, the pretense of being entirely at ease. She recognized it, because dancers, too, understand what it means to make the impossible look effortless. They were married on the 3rd of February, 1938, at the Marylebone Register Office. A modest affair. He was 26. She was a working dancer with a foreign-sounding name in a country that would, within 18 months, be at war with half of Europe. They took a small flat and filled it with the ordinary hopes of young couples everywhere. When the war came, Tom Stevens enlisted and was posted to the Royal Corps of Signals. Someone in authority noticed that the young signalman had a talent more immediately useful than Morse code. He could make exhausted, frightened men forget, for a few minutes, that they were exhausted and frightened. He was transferred to stars in battle dress, the Army's entertainment division. For the remainder of the war, he performed on makeshift stages in requisitioned halls, in hangars that smelled of engine oil and anxiety, before audiences of soldiers who laughed with the ferocity of men who knew that laughter, unlike survival, was guaranteed for at least the next hour. By 1943, his body had begun to register its own complaints. A stomach ulcer, the classic affliction of the anxious, the driven, the man who swallows his feelings rather than expressing them. It was treated and managed, but it was the first signal that the machine had limits. The war ended. Britain emerged blinking into a peace that felt almost as austere as the conflict that had preceded it. Rationing continued. Bomb sites gaped in the streets like missing teeth. Into this atmosphere stepped a man with a monocle, a carnation, and an absolute refusal to acknowledge that anything was less than splendid. The BBC gave him his platform, first radio, where his voice, that extraordinary instrument, drawling and precise, capable of making the word shower sound like a mortal insult, reached millions. Then television. How do you view? Ran from 1949 to 1953 and made him a household name. The format was loose, the budgets microscopic, and the technology frequently rebelled, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the face. The raised eyebrow, the curled lip, the monocle glinting under studio lights, and above all the gap, that glorious, unmistakable space between the front teeth, which the camera loved as much as the audience did. He appeared twice on Desert Island Discs, the long-running BBC radio program in which notable guests choose the music they would take to a desert island. First in 1956 and again in 1970. A distinction reserved for those whom the nation considers not merely famous, but somehow essential. He even cut a handful of gramophone records, which suggests either remarkable confidence or a touching deafness to his own musical limitations. In 1947, the hyphen arrived, and Thomas Stevens formally ceased to exist. Terry Thomas was born. The reasoning was characteristically playful. The hyphen bound the two names together, he explained, as the gap bound his front teeth. A defect made deliberate, a flaw rebranded as a feature. But the flaw in his marriage could not be so easily rebranded. Success changed the domestic arithmetic. By the early 50s, his face was on magazine covers, his voice on the wireless, his diary a chaos of engagements. Ida was at home. There were no children. There would never be children from this marriage. The infidelities, when they came, arrived from both directions. According to his own account, and it should be noted that this version originates from him alone, she strayed first. He responded in kind. He arranged touring engagements in France, dispatching his wife back to England while he remained behind for what he described as business. They both knew. They both pretended not to know. By 1954, they were living apart. That same year on stage, he fell and broke his arm. He was back in 5 days. A colleague intercepted him backstage. "You're mad. Your arm's in plaster and you're going on." My dear fellow, the audience laughed so hard I was considering breaking the other one for an encore. And seriously, a plaster cast itches worse in an empty flat. The last line hung in the air. There are remarks that close a conversation not because they are final, but because they are true. The late 1950s drew him towards the international stage, but the ascent nearly faltered before it began. On the 23rd of December, 1957, he was filming The Naked Truth. His back was in agony, lumbago, and the doctor had prescribed codeine. It was a Christmas party at the Trocadero. There was champagne. A man of his generation would no more refuse a glass than appear in public without a pressed handkerchief. The codeine and the champagne held a quiet conversation inside his bloodstream, and the result was that he got behind the wheel and drove in a manner that attracted the Metropolitan Police. He was arrested. The court date fell on the 14th of March, 1958. The medical report confirmed the interaction between painkiller and alcohol. The police testimony contained inconsistencies. He was acquitted. He walked out of the courthouse and said something deft to the waiting journalists, something about codeine and good breeding, the precise words unrecorded, but the tone is easy to imagine. Breezy, faintly indignant, laced with the suggestion that a gentleman does not get caught. The press moved on. He did not. It was the first time the carefully maintained surface had cracked where people could see. Despite the scare, Hollywood had noticed the English comedian with the gap in his teeth. Tom Thumb, spelled unusually in lower case, arrived later that year and opened the door. A children's fantasy, an unlikely vehicle for a man whose natural habitat was the cocktail party, but the camera loved him regardless of context. American audiences understood nothing about the English class system, but they understood perfectly the comedy of a man who believes himself superior and is not. The money arrived. Not the careful sums of BBC television, but Hollywood money, £5,000 a week at the peak. He bought a house on Ibiza. A white villa on a hill above the sea, with terracotta tiles and bougainvillea climbing the walls and a terrace where the evening light turned the water from blue to gold. Guests came. Actors, producers, friends from the London years. There were long dinners under the stars, bottles of wine that nobody counted, and the sound of laughter carrying over the hillside into the warm dark. He flew first class. The red carnation became a daily ritual delivered fresh each morning. It was during these years that he met Laurie Desmond. She was Australian, an actress, a singer, a woman of talent and independence. Their relationship was serious. It lasted several years, running parallel to the decaying marriage with Ida. The details have not survived, where they met, what drew them together, what precisely drove them apart. But the outcome is confirmed by multiple sources. When it ended, the wound was genuine. He grieved. Not publicly. The persona did not permit that, but in the spaces between performances, in hotel rooms in cities whose names blurred together, he felt the loss. No other confirmed relationships exist in the record. The press occasionally hinted at further liaisons, but these remain rumor without substance, and to invent what the evidence does not support would be a dishonesty this story should resist. The divorce from Ida was finalized on the 1st of February, 1962. 8 years of separation formalized at last. They parted with a chilly civility. Ida moved to Mallorca, and here the story takes one of its most unexpected turns. They remained friends. She would, 21 years later, leave him a cottage in her will. He met Belinda Cunningham in approximately 1961, on holiday in Mallorca, a detail containing its own small irony, since Mallorca was also the island to which his first wife would retreat. Belinda was younger, outside the world of film. She had fallen for the man behind the act, the one who removed the monocle behind closed doors and was simply tired, witty, and vulnerable. They married in August of 1963 at the Halstead Registry Office in Essex. A second marriage, a second chance. Then fatherhood. Timothy, known almost immediately as Tiger, arrived in approximately 1964. A second son, Cushion, followed. For the first time in his life, the performer was a parent. He was past 50. Belinda held the baby up. "Well then, you're a father now." He looked at his son. Silence. "I do hope he gets proper teeth." She laughed. He laughed too, but behind the laughter was the apprehension of a man who could impersonate anyone but had no script for this particular role. The mid-60s were the summit. It's a mad, 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 mad world in 1963, alongside Spencer Tracy, Milton Berle, and Buster Keaton. His catchphrase, "What an absolute shower," entered the language. Those magnificent men in their flying machines followed in 1965, and the role of Sir Percy Ware Armitage became the definitive distillation of everything he did best. There is a sequence in which Sir Percy, attempting to sabotage a rival's aeroplane, becomes entangled in the aircraft's rigging and is hoisted into the air, legs flailing, moustache bristling, dignity in ruins. He hangs there, suspended between earth and sky, and the expression on his face, outrage, bewilderment, and the absolute refusal to concede that anything is amiss, is a masterclass in physical comedy. The audience roared. They always roared. He was never the hero. He was the man the hero defeated, and that was his genius. Audiences came to see the protagonist triumph, but it was the antagonist they remembered. The films multiplied. Italy, France, Hollywood, back to England. The money flowed. And then, quietly, in the late 60s, something changed. A tremor in his left hand. Barely perceptible at first, the faintest vibration, as though a tuning fork had been struck somewhere deep inside the tendons. He noticed it at dinner one evening. The wine in his glass trembled, though his hand appeared still. He set the glass down, picked it up. The tremor returned. He told no one. He ascribed it to exhaustion, to age. The explanation satisfied him. It did not satisfy the tremor, which continued like a clock ticking in an empty room. In 1971, that ticking became a diagnosis. He visited a doctor with the confidence of a man accustomed to problems that could be solved with wit or money. He walked out with a single word lodged in his chest like a blade. Parkinson's. The substantia nigra, a small, dark region deep in the midbrain, was failing. The neurons there, whose sole purpose was to produce dopamine, the chemical messenger that carries instructions from brain to muscle, were dying. Not all at once. One by one, like lights going out along a corridor. The messages still originated. The brain still said lift, still said grip, still said smile. But somewhere between intention and execution, the signal degraded. What arrived at the other end was a tremor, a stiffness, a hesitation, and eventually a silence where movement should have been. For anyone, such a diagnosis is a catastrophe. For a comic actor whose instrument is his body, whose currency is the precisely timed gesture and the immaculately controlled expression, it is something closer to annihilation. The hangman does not hurry. He does not need to. He was 59, or 60, the disputed birth date makes even this uncertain. He had 2 young sons, a villa on Ibiza, a career that, while past its zenith, still commanded international bookings. He had everything to live for, and now he had been told that his body would dismantle itself piece by piece while his mind watched. He went back to work. This is not merely bravery. It is also denial, the particular, ferocious denial of a man who has spent his entire life constructing an image of effortless competence and cannot admit that the effort has become impossible. For years after the diagnosis, he continued to accept roles. The films grew smaller, Italian comedies, French farces, productions that bore little resemblance to the Hollywood work of the previous decade, but they paid, and payment meant occupation, and occupation meant he did not have to sit in a quiet room and contemplate what was happening to his hands. On set, the deception held for a while. Makeup artists noticed that his fingers trembled when fastening a collar button. Assistant directors observed that he gripped furniture a little too tightly when crossing a room. He deflected every inquiry with the only tool he had ever truly mastered. A director approached him cautiously between takes. "Terry, perhaps another go at that." The hand was a touch. "My dear fellow, that is not a tremor. That is an acting choice. My character is nervous." "Your character is a gardener." "Precisely. Have you seen English gardens? Enough to make anyone nervous." Everyone laughed. In the evening, alone in the dressing room, he sat and looked at his hands, the instruments of a lifetime's craft. The hands that had held the cigarette holder at that precise angle, adjusted the monocle with that precise flourish, gestured with the authority of a man conducting an invisible orchestra. He watched them disobey him. The left shook. The right, not yet. But the right was watching the left, and they both knew what was coming. His last appearance on screen came in 1980. The precise film is a matter of some dispute among archivists, but the date is confirmed. He was 68 or 69, and the career that had begun on the sticky floors of pre-war variety halls ended in an editing suite somewhere, with a final cut that no one now remembers. There was no farewell interview, no valedictory press release. He simply stopped. The telephone, which had once rung with the persistence of a fire alarm, fell silent. The camera, his most reliable partner, the one collaborator that never asked uncomfortable questions, had been forced to look away. Not from cruelty, from honesty. The camera cannot lie, and the truth had become unbearable. At home, Belinda managed the unmanageable. There is a moment, unreported by any newspaper, unrecorded by any biographer, but as certain as anything can be in a story where the private is sealed away from the public, when the weight of it must have settled on her fully. Perhaps it was a Tuesday. Perhaps it was a morning when she had spent 20 minutes buttoning his shirt because his fingers could not find the holes, and the shirt was the wrong one anyway, and the toast had gone cold, and one of the boys needed something for school, and the telephone bill sat unopened on the hall table because she knew what it contained and could not face it. Perhaps she stood in the kitchen afterwards, alone, her hands on the edge of the sink, and allowed herself 30 seconds of absolute stillness. Not weeping. Not self-pity. Just the pause that the body demands when the mind has been running without rest for too long. Then she dried her hands, picked up the telephone bill, opened it, and continued. The medications alone cost £40,000 a year. Then the specialists. Then the physiotherapists. Then the private consultations, and the second opinions, and the third opinions. Each one extracting its fee from a fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible, and was now evaporating at a speed that defied belief. He sold the house on Ibiza, the terrace where he had stood with a glass of wine watching the Mediterranean, the rooms where his sons had taken their first steps, the garden where Belinda had planted bougainvillea because the color reminded her of happiness. All of it converted to cash. All of it fed into a disease that consumed money as efficiently as it consumed motor function. Then he invested in films. 3 low-budget productions. B-pictures, the kind of enterprise that promises returns of 300% and delivers precisely 0. He had appeared in more than 40 motion pictures. He understood the industry as intimately as anyone alive. He backed 3 losers with the last of his savings and lost every penny. The man who had spent a career playing fools had become one, not on screen, where foolishness was profitable, but in life, where it was ruinous. By 1983, the money was gone. That same year in June, on the island of Majorca, Ida Patlansky died, the first wife, the dancer from the audition in 1937. The woman he had married in Marylebone, betrayed in France, divorced in 1962, and somehow remained friends with through all the years that followed. She left him a cottage in her will. From beyond the grave, the woman he had wronged reached out and gave him a roof, not from vengeance, not from pity, from something harder to name, perhaps the residual habit of caring for a person long after you have stopped loving them. The way a gardener waters a plant not from affection, but from an inability to watch anything die through neglect. Belinda told him, "Tom, Ida's died." A pause. When? Last week. The solicitor rang. She left you the cottage. A longer pause, a silence with weight in it. Well, even after the divorce, she never stopped tidying up after me. Belinda said nothing. There are sentences to which no response exists. The cottage bought time. It did not buy a future. By 1987, the Actors' Benevolent Fund had stepped in and provided accommodation. A flat. Not a slum, but not a home. A room with walls, a window, and a view of someone else's life going on outside. Daily existence contracted to its smallest possible circumference. Tablets in the morning, tablets at noon, tablets in the evening. A slow walk, when the body permitted, to the end of the corridor and back. Television. Sometimes on the screen, a younger version of himself appeared. Upright, nimble, impossibly alive, striding through some scene from a film made 30 years ago. The man on the screen and the man watching bore the same name. That was the extent of their resemblance, but he retained his wit. And this matters, because without it the story becomes merely pathetic, and pathetic is the one thing this man never was. Richard Briers came to visit. Briers was a fine actor and a gentle man, and he arrived expecting devastation. The flat was small. The furniture was institutional. The light from the single window fell on a figure seated in a chair by the wall, diminished, rigid, motionless in the way that the disease enforces, a parody of the stillness that an actor deploys by choice. Briers sat down across from him and searched for something to say. He did not need to search for long. Terry Thomas spoke first. The words came slowly, effortfully, dragged from a throat that no longer cooperated, but they came, and they were funny. What precisely he said, the record does not preserve. But Briers, speaking later to journalists, described what he found in that flat with a bluntness that suggests the memory never softened. A crippled, crushed shadow. It was really bloody awful. And yet the shadow had made him laugh. That was the part that broke Briers, not the illness, not the poverty. The fact that a man stripped of everything could still, from the ruins, produce the one thing he had always produced. Briers left the flat and stood in the corridor outside, and whatever he felt in that moment, he carried with him for the rest of his life. There were dark days. The kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the dawning recognition that this flat, this chair, these tablets, this slow diminishment, is not a temporary setback, but the rest of one's life. He spoke privately of wanting it to end. Friends who visited in 1984 reported that he was consumed by depression, that the man who had cheered millions could not find a reason to cheer himself. The specifics of what he said remain unverified by published sources. What is verified beyond dispute is that he did not act on whatever thoughts he harbored. He stayed, and then, slowly, improbably, through the tenacity of friendship rather than the machinery of fame, rescue began to assemble itself. Jack Douglas picked up the telephone and began to ring around. The calls went out to the old crowd, the survivors of Variety, the veterans of Pinewood, the men and women who had shared stages and dressing rooms, and the peculiar camaraderie of people who make strangers laugh for a living. Some said yes immediately. Some hesitated. Some did not return the call. Show business was a family, but a selective one, the kind that embraces you warmly at the christening and pretends not to know your address when the bailiffs arrive. But enough said yes. Enough remembered. Enough felt the uncomfortable prick of conscience that comes from realizing that a man who gave you decades of laughter cannot now afford his own tablets. And so the plans were laid for an evening at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, one of the oldest theatres in London, a temple of comedy, a building in which Nell Gwynn had performed, and generations of audiences had surrendered to the ancient pleasure of being made to laugh. A fitting venue for what no one could bring themselves to call a farewell. The question that hovered over the preparations, unasked but present, was simple. Would it make a difference? £75,000, the eventual sum, would cover perhaps 2 years of treatment at the current rate. It would not halt the disease. It would not restore the house on Ibiza, the films, the ovations, or the ability to hold a cigarette holder at the correct angle. It would buy time. And time for a man with Parkinson's is not a simple gift. It is more of everything, including more of the thing that is destroying you. But they raised it anyway, because the alternative was worse. And because the evening was not really about money. It was about acknowledgement. 800 people standing up and saying, with their applause, "We remember what you gave us." And so we return to the 9th of April, 1989. To the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, to the corridor backstage. But we return knowing what we did not know at the beginning, and knowledge changes everything. We know now that the woman pushing the chair has been doing this for nearly 20 years. That she married a charming, successful man on the cusp of international fame, and that within 8 years of their wedding, a disease had begun to unpick him from the inside, and that she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because she had made a choice, and the choice was him. Not Terry Thomas, the character, the brand, the gap-toothed rogue beloved of audiences from Piccadilly to Pasadena. Tom, the man without the act. We know now that the suit hanging from his shoulders is hanging from a body that once earned £5,000 a week and now subsists on charity. We know that the cigarette holder in the breast pocket is the last surviving fragment of an image that took decades to construct and a disease to demolish. We know that the hands folded in his lap are the same hands that once held a monocle, wielded a walking stick, and gestured with the precision of a conductor. And so the scene, revisited, becomes almost unbearable. He was brought onto the stage. The chair emerged from the wings into the light, and the audience fell silent for a single breath, and then they rose. The ovation was not the kind he had known before. In the old days, applause had been bright, sharp, percussive, the sound of pleasure. This was different, softer, deeper, more sustained, the sound of something that lives in the space between admiration and grief. They did not stop, and he sat in his chair in the middle of it and tried to nod. The muscles in his neck resisted. A tear ran down his cheek. Belinda drove home afterwards. He sat in the back seat, not because he chose to, but because the logistics of disability imposed their own indignities. London past the windows. April rain on glass. "Tom, are you all right?" Silence. The particular silence of a man assembling words from a reduced vocabulary and a rebellious throat. "Tom." Quietly, almost inaudibly. They stood up. Did you see? They all stood up. I saw. Before, they used to stand up because I made them laugh. Tonight they stood because they feel sorry for me. She did not correct him, did not console him. She drove. The street lamps flickered across the windscreen, and the car moved through the London night towards a future measured not in years but in months. 9 months. That was what remained. He was moved to Busbridge Hall, a nursing home in Godalming, Surrey. A handsome building in handsome grounds, green lawns, mature trees, the kind of English landscape that conveys serenity to those unfamiliar with its purpose. Inside, the corridors were clean and quiet and smelled of disinfectant and milky tea. Belinda came every day. She arrived. She sat. She held his hand, or what remained of his hand's capacity to be held, the fingers stiff, the grip absent, the warmth still there, but the intention behind it locked away somewhere inaccessible. She talked to him, whether he responded and how, and what passed between them in those hours belongs to them alone. Timothy was 25, Cushion a year or two younger. They were building their own lives in a world that had no particular use for the sons of a fading comedian. They visited when they could. Their absence, when they could not, was not cruelty. It was the inability, common to the young and forgivable in the young, to sit in a room with mortality and not flinch. The 8th of January 1990. Death arrived without fanfare. No dramatic final words. No last gasp rally. No Hollywood ending. And this seems right, because Hollywood, despite having employed him handsomely for 2 decades, had forgotten him years ago, and he owed it nothing in return. He died at Busbridge Hall of complications arising from the disease that had occupied the last 19 years of his life. He was 78 years old. We do not know whether Belinda was in the room at the precise moment. We do not know what he saw, if he saw anything, whether the fading consciousness offered a final reel, the lights of Drury Lane, or the sun over Ibiza, or the Smithfield porters laughing at his impressions, or whether there was simply a gradual dimming, like a theatre going dark after the last curtain call, the house lights lowered, the auditorium emptying, the ushers sweeping the aisles of a venue that will open again tomorrow for someone else's show. The funeral was held at the Church of St. John the Baptist. The cremation took place at Guildford Crematorium. Both were conducted with the restrained dignity that the English bring to their farewells, the tight lips, the hymns sung in voices that tremble only on the high notes, the handshakes at the door that say everything the words cannot. For a man who had known everyone in Hollywood, the ceremony was quiet. England buries its comedians without trumpets. The obituaries appeared the following day. The New York Times, the Times of London, the Guardian. The tone was uniform. A great comedian, a tragic end, a life that began in laughter and concluded in silence. Not one of them asked the question that ought to have been asked. How is it possible that a man who enriched millions of lives with joy died on the charity of a benevolent fund? And then, the particular silence that follows a death. not the dramatic silence of the moment itself, but the longer, flatter, more absolute silence of aftermath. A name that stops appearing in newspapers, a telephone that no one rings, a wardrobe of suits that no one will wear, a cigarette holder that no one will raise, a gap between two teeth that no one will ever see again. Belinda Cunningham vanished from public life with the same quietness with which she had entered it. She did not write a memoir. She did not sell her story. In an era when the widows of celebrities routinely convert grief into content, she chose privacy. This choice may have been the most eloquent statement anyone made about the man she had married, that some things are not for sharing, and that the most profound form of loyalty is the refusal to explain it. Of Timothy and Cushion, the record reveals almost nothing. They did not enter entertainment. They did not trade on the name or license the image. They lived, as far as the evidence suggests, private lives. If this sounds unremarkable, consider what it required. The discipline to resist the gravitational pull of a famous parent, the resolve to answer the inevitable question, Stevens, not related to, with composure rather than anecdote. The archetype he created did not die with him. The cad, the charming scoundrel, the man whose impeccable manners serve as camouflage for impeccable selfishness. This entered the bloodstream of British comedy and emerged in forms he might or might not have recognized. Rowan Atkinson acknowledged the influence. John Cleese, as Basil Fawlty, drew from the same well. Hugh Laurie, as Bertie Wooster, inherited the tradition so completely that the line of descent is visible to anyone who cares to look. The gap-toothed bounder from Finchley fathered, in the artistic sense, an entire lineage of screen characters whose gift is to be simultaneously appalling and irresistible. There is no memorial plaque on the house in Finchley, no annual award in his name, no biographical film. Comedians are rarely commemorated in bronze or stone. The medium resists it. A statue cannot deliver a punchline. A plaque cannot raise an eyebrow. The art of making people laugh depends, more than any other art, on the physical presence of the artist. And when the artist is gone, the art goes with him, leaving behind only recordings and memories and the fading sense, in those old enough to remember, that the world was briefly lighter because this person was in it. What remains, then? What endures beyond the gap and the monocle and the carnation and the drawl? More than one might think. But to understand what remains, one must first understand what was lost. And what was lost was not merely a man or a career or a fortune squandered on medicine and bad investments. What was lost was the answer to a question that he had been asking silently since the age of 6. Am I anything without the act? Beneath every role he ever played, beneath the monocle and the carnation and the hyphen and the gap, there lived a boy who had discovered, at the age of 6, that the only reliable method of preventing two adults from destroying each other was to make them laugh. He had spent his life repeating that trick, first in a sitting room in Finchley, then in music halls, then on the BBC, then in Hollywood, then across 3 continents and 4 decades. The audience expanded from 2 unhappy parents to millions of strangers, but the mechanism never changed. People are in pain. You make them laugh. The pain recedes. They love you for it. And as long as they love you, you are safe. The flaw in the mechanism was that it worked in only one direction. He could relieve the pain of others. He could not relieve his own. The audience went home lighter. He went home to an empty dressing room, or an unhappy marriage, or a rented flat, or a nursing home in Surrey, carrying the weight of every performance like a man who has spent the day holding up a ceiling for the benefit of people who never thought to ask what it cost him. When the disease arrived, it did not merely attack his body, it attacked the mechanism. It took away the instruments of his craft, the mobile face, the precise hands, the commanding voice. Without those instruments, the trick could not be performed. And without the trick, who was he? Thomas Terry Horse Stevens, son of a clerk and a housewife from North London, a man with an unfortunate surname and a space between his front teeth. A man who had been afraid all his life that if the laughter ever stopped, there would be nothing underneath it. The disease tested that fear with a thoroughness that no human antagonist could have matched. It stripped away the performance. It removed the armor. It left him sitting in a chair in a room in Godalming with nothing but himself for company. Or perhaps the answer was there all along, visible not to him, but to the people closest to him. Belinda had not married the act. She had married the man, and she had stayed with the man long after the act had crumbled. His sons had grown up knowing not the national treasure, but their father flawed, diminished, present in the ways that mattered. Richard Briers had visited and found, amid the wreckage, a wit that refused to surrender. Even Ida, the first wife, the woman he had wronged, had looked past the betrayals and seen something worth saving, something durable enough to survive divorce and distance and 2 decades of separate lives, something that moved her to leave a cottage in her will as a final, wordless act of recognition, that beneath the performance there had always been a person. Whether he knew this, whether, in the long silences of the nursing home, he arrived at any understanding of his own value beyond the stage, is impossible to say. The interior life of another human being is, in the end, inaccessible. We can reconstruct the events. We can chart the trajectory. We can note the dates, separate the confirmed from the rumored, the documented from the imagined. But the essential question, what did it feel like to be this man, at the end, with the applause a distant memory and the body a cage and the mind still turning? That question died with him on the 8th of January, 1990. He was not the first performer to be consumed by the machinery that made him. The catalogue is long enough to constitute, if one were inclined to dark humour, a routine in itself. Buster Keaton spent his final decades in poverty, his genius acknowledged only when he was too old and too ill to benefit from the acknowledgement. Tony Hancock took his own life in a motel room in Sydney, surrounded by empty bottles and unfinished scripts. Kenneth Williams died of an overdose in 1988, 1 year before the Drury Lane Gala, leaving behind a diary entry so bleak that it still has the power to stop a reader mid-sentence. Peter Sellers collapsed at 54, his heart broken in the most literal sense by a life conducted at an unsustainable pitch. The list continues. An industry built on the production of joy generates a remarkable quantity of destroyed lives. The paradox is so persistent that it begins to look less like coincidence than like structure, something inherent in the work itself, something that no amount of money or acclaim can protect against. Britain in the 1960s needed Terry Thomas. It needed him specifically and urgently. The class system, that vast, intricate, profoundly English edifice of accent and address, and the correct way to hold a teacup, was under pressure, cracking along its ancient fault lines. Into the cracks stepped a man who mocked it from the inside. He wore the monocle, but he wore it with a smirk. He played the aristocrat, but he played him as a fool. The upper classes recognized the satire and appreciated it, because they have always enjoyed being laughed at, provided the laughter comes from someone who understands the rules. The working and middle classes enjoyed it for simpler reasons. The spectacle of a toff making an ass of himself is one of the deep, uncomplicated pleasures of English life. By the 1980s, the country had moved on. Thatcher. Punk. A brasher cynicism that had no patience for the old, gentle, winking style of comedy. The culture wanted something louder, faster, angrier. The monocle and the carnation began to look quaint, and quaintness, in Britain, is respected but not funded. The nation reveres its traditions, displays them in glass cases, and quietly allows the people who embody them to starve. There is a transaction that occurs every time a performer steps before an audience. It is so ancient, so deeply embedded, that neither party examines its terms. The performer gives laughter, or tears, or wonder. The audience gives applause and money and the intoxicating but perishable commodity called fame. Both sides consider the exchange fair. Neither reads the fine print. The fine print states that the performer's obligation is open-ended. He must continue to give for as long as the audience wishes to receive, while the audience's obligation expires the moment the curtain falls. When the function ceases, the contract is void, and the performer reverts to what he was before anyone noticed him. Nobody. Nobody with memories. Nobody with medical bills. Nobody with a cigarette holder in a drawer and a wardrobe of suits that no longer fit. On the 9th of April, 1989, when the auditorium rose and the applause broke over him, a tear ran down the cheek of the man in the wheelchair. In that tear, had anyone leaned close enough to see, was reflected the whole extraordinary, ordinary span of a human life. The meat market and the movie studios. The smoke-filled music halls and the sunlit terrace on Ibiza. The hands that once held a champagne flute with the insouciance of a duke, and the hands that now lay folded and useless in his lap. Ida, who forgave. Laurie, who left. Belinda, who remained. Two boys who would grow up and find their own way in a world that would never quite stop asking about their father. And the gap. That irreducible 7-millimeter space between two teeth. The trademark. The fortune. The floor transformed into a feature. It had been, for 50 years, the most recognizable mouth in British entertainment, suggesting simultaneously the bite of wit and the vulnerability of a man who has learned to present his imperfections before anyone else can use them against him. It was, in its small way, a work of genius, the understanding that what makes us memorable is not our perfections but our fractures. Not the seamless surface, but the place where the surface breaks and something human shows through. The theatre is dark now. The chairs are empty. Tomorrow, another show will open. Another performer will step into the light, and another audience will settle into its seats, and the ancient transaction will begin again, the giving and the taking, the laughter offered and the laughter consumed. Somewhere in Godalming, in a building surrounded by green lawns, a room was cleaned and prepared for its next occupant. The bed was stripped. The personal effects were removed. The window was open to let in the January air, cold, damp, carrying the distant sound of traffic and birdsong, and all the ordinary noises of a world that continues regardless of who has left it. The room held no trace of the man who died there. But somewhere in a dusty cassette at the back of a cupboard, in a late-night broadcast stumbled upon by an insomniac, in the memory of a man or woman who sat in a darkened cinema in 1963 and watched a figure in a monocle attempt, with sublime and doomed determination, to cheat his way to victory somewhere. The gap still grins. The eyebrow still rises. The voice still drawls. And for a moment, brief and flickering, the man from Finchley is alive again, and the audience is laughing, and the distance between performer and public has collapsed to nothing, and the wheelchair and the nursing home and the tremor and the tear are all still decades away, invisible, unimaginable, belonging to a future that the man on the screen does not suspect, and the audience will never think to prevent. The gap between the teeth. The gap between the man and the myth. The gap between what we owe our jesters and what we pay them. It was always there. It is there still.